If you're a newcomer to the fighting game genre, then you'll most certainly be familiar with the experience of buying a game, waiting 7 years for it to download because you're Australian, and then having fun playing it with everyone for the next 6 or so years before a sequel releases. But hang on, in terms of new content, what exactly goes on in this empty space here? Surely there's gotta be something going on, right? Nowadays, fighting games are kept alive by frequent balance patches that we download for free, and while some of them can add cool new characters and costumes, others make their entire player base suicidal. So there's a lot of variation between the quality of these patches, but that's not exactly what this video is about. Instead, we're gonna go way back to a time when the internet wasn't nearly as mainstream as it is today, and we're gonna see how this impacted the advancement of fighting game lifespans. You may have seen phrases like Super, Ultimate, Gold, Dark Resurrection, or even Sculptor's Cut before, and I want to get to the bottom of all this madness and understand the why behind these games. Whether you call them updates, revisions, or whatever, these incremental entries into a series are some of the most iconic parts of fighting game history, and despite their importance, I realized that I've never made a video about this topic before. Things like patch culture and having direct access to a game's development studio via social media simply didn't exist back in the dark ages, but they're aspects of the fighting game scene that we kind of all take for granted nowadays. As a supreme zoomer myself, I could only imagine how confusing certain information could be without the option of just doing a quick Google search. Our mission for today, dear viewer, is to determine the history of the fighting game title update and figure out where we are today, leaving no stone unturned. This topic is very specific, and although there aren't many resources for me to consult, I did my best to collect accurate information, so buckle up and get ready for the wacky story of fighting game title updates. Ever since their inception with 1938's Yi Er Kung Fu, fighting games have had an extensive history in arcades, and if you were around back then, I'm sure that there was no escaping popular titles like Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat, especially because of their loud and attention-grabbing cabinets. These things looked massive to me when I was a kid, and their colourful artwork made my twist head like I was in The Exorcist to soak it all up. But look, jokes aside, the machinery and technical limitations are crucial to this story. Due to 90s internet access and speeds being borderline medieval when compared to what we're used to today, there was no chance of these machines commonly sharing internet connectivity, and this brings me to my first major point, a lack of downloading. I'll use one of my favorite 90s fighting games, Killer Instinct, to demonstrate what needed to happen if arcade game developers wanted to update their games. Okay, get this. After KI released in 1994 and became a smash hit, people found that Cinder, this flame guy, had an infinite combo that, as far as I know, could soft-lock the machine if you kept it going. And this meant that arcade operators would actually have to go behind the machine and restart the whole thing. A bug this severe is simply unacceptable from a game developer's standpoint, so when developer Rare and publisher Nintendo heard about the bug, they devised a way to fix the issue. Since they couldn't just install a patch via the internet, both groups had to send a team of technicians to physically travel to arcades and update the boards inside of the cabinets. This might not sound too bad until you realize that they had to manually update 17,000 cabinets across the whole of America. Hypothetically, if it took 1 hour to travel to each machine and install the patch, this means the entire process would have taken 17,000 hours or over 700 days. This is obviously way too long, so developers needed a quick method of rolling out not only bug fixes and balance updates, but also brand new content, and this brings us back to Capcom. After Street Fighter II first released in February 1991 and grossed more money than my mother's place of origin, Capcom was excited to keep running wild with their beloved series, and they did so with the first ever fighting game title update. By the way, my definition of a title update is an update to a pre-existing game that aims to build on it by adding new content and balance changes. Anyway, according to the timeline section of the Fighters Generation, which is a fantastic website by the way, Street Fighter II Champion Edition released in April 1992, and Street Fighter II Turbo came out that December. That's 3 Street Fighter II titles before 1993, and speaking of 1993, that's when Super Street Fighter II released. From what this timeline tells us, other companies like SNK were also hopping on this trend with games like Fatal Fury Special, an updated version of Fatal Fury 2, although most 1993 fighting games were brand new titles. This principle also applies to 1994, as new games like Tekken, Children of the Atom, Primal Rage, The King of Fighters 94, and Darkstalkers all kicked butt, and these two were even developed by Capcom themselves, so the Big C was pumping out original titles at a rapid pace. At this point in the genre's lifespan, title updates and revisions were definitely part of fighting game culture, but they played second fiddle to sequels and new IPs, and it seems that Capcom was the only company doing more than one title update at a time. A general rule of thumb is that if you somehow time travel back to 1994 and walk into an arcade, you're gonna see more original fighting games than title updates, and it was like this for quite some time. The only problem for developers is that having to design multiple new games and release them on a consistent basis is no easy task, and even though classics like Street Fighter Alpha, for example, were developed under ridiculously short deadlines, it's simply not feasible to expect small development teams to work non-stop on new ideas and just never somehow burn out. So releasing smaller titles that reuse pre-existing assets to keep the hype train going in between larger games was a sound strategy. And I mean, it's not like fighting game fans were forced to play like maybe 2 or 3 major titles, because Capcom, SNK, Midway, Sega, Namco, Rare, and the crackheads behind the GOAT Waku Waku 7 were dropping new games left, right, and center. Seriously, fighting game fans were spoiled for choice back in the mid-90s, but as time went on, more and more title updates started to emerge, and as a result, more and more people started to notice, especially when you had to keep buying them. Fighting game home ports are a whole other can of worms, but as consoles were technologically inferior to their arcade counterparts, the visuals, audio, and controls of these titles weren't as pleasing when experienced at home, but that didn't stop publishers from charging full price for these home ports. Hell, even Capcom themselves made fun of this practice with a certain piece of Dead Rising 3 DLC that I won't even try to pronounce. You might not mind dropping quarters into the 3rd or 4th Street Fighter 2 revision in the arcade, but having to pay full price yet again for a game that you kind of already owned marked a transformation in the title update phenomenon. As I was browsing through the aforementioned Fighters Generation website, I noticed a very interesting trend in their timeline, and I wanted to try and quantify it. If we look at the first 10 years of the fighting game genre, there were a total of 6 title updates out of 67 fighting games, indicating that while the concept of title updates had started to encroach the mainstream, most series had yet to adopt this policy, and even though they did over time, I have a bit of a confession to make. Going into this video, I had the assumption that these updates would have followed the tale of being obscure, and then popular, and then going away again. But after looking through all the fighting games on the list from 1996 onwards, I had my expectations shattered from how little updates there were. When we think of title updates, we mostly tend to picture Street Fighter in our mind, and even though 90s and early 2000s games like Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 and Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection serve as popular revisions outside of the Capcom bubble, even these series were predominantly kept alive through new games and not updates. We'll focus on Capcom specifically in a bit, but for now, it's important to note that most companies were staying afloat by releasing sequels. Now that I think about it, maybe SNK isn't the best example of staying afloat. A great example of this occurrence involves our Blue Friends 1998 output, as they had 6 titles all releasing throughout the year, and that's not even mentioning the 10 games they shot out the following year. That's 16 brand new fighting games for a variety of platforms in 2 years, and the total increases to 17 if you include their Card Fighters game. Moving forward into the 2000s now, you often hear people label this period as the dark age of fighting games, but in reality, fighting games were constantly being released throughout this period. There weren't as many fighting games in, say, 2004 when compared to 1994, but there are still a few titles here, and most of them aren't title updates. Anyway, back to Capcom. Most of their fighting games from this period strike me as being very interesting, as although games like these are new titles, they make extensive use of pre-existing assets, so they're not entirely original, I suppose. They also don't represent the bulk of Capcom's output during this time, and this ties into a second major observation I noticed during my research. As I mentioned before, people were getting fed up with buying what they saw as the same game over and over again, so most companies were starting to realize that these updates were getting a bit out of hand. Capcom looked at these guys and said, heh, idiots, and they put out Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max, Puzzle Fighter HD Remix, and Super Turbo HD Remix, just to name a few. A few years later in 2011, February's Marvel vs. Capcom 3 even received a major title update, the first the series had ever seen. Outside of tag team fighters that also start real fights, Street Fighter 4 also received many updates, with each of them adding more and more content. Just like with Street Fighter 2, fans were forced to buy these if they wanted their game to stay relevant, but over time, Capcom had a thought. Okay guys, Ultra Street Fighter 4 is coming out soon, and we have an idea. What if we provide consumers with a way to digitally upgrade their older games to Ultra without needing to go out and actually buy a new physical disc? This could save us money, while also getting more people comfortable with the idea of digital upgrades. And they did just that, as when Ultra was announced, you could purchase the game as a form of DLC for Super Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition, and this is when Capcom started to introduce such a method for their fighting games. Moving forward now to 2016 Street Fighter V, this title was designed from the ground up to serve as a games-as-a-service title, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense for this game to receive a title update, right? I mean, Capcom can just keep updating the game for as long as they want without needing to sell it again, and this can lead to all sorts of brand new content. Damn it. 2018 Street Fighter V Arcade Edition and 2020 Street Fighter V Champion Edition are major title updates, introducing new mechanics, stages, and characters, but unlike Ultra, these games were actually free. Well, kind of. If you already own Street Fighter V, you could download these revisions for free, but you wouldn't unlock any of the new characters or stages, so it's best to think of this route as a patch. On the other hand, if you didn't already own the game and then you bought the update, you could get all the content from the get-go. In case you couldn't tell, this whole Street Fighter tangent I wrote while suffering from a severe lack of sleep highlights how Capcom just couldn't kick their habit of releasing title updates, and even though some games from this generation received box and digital upgrades, they were totally different to their older brothers. Take something like Tekken 7 Definitive Edition for example. If you own this game and your friend owns vanilla Tekken 7 with absolutely no DLC, you guys are still playing the exact same game. They have the same character roster, game balance, content, netcode, etc., so you can play online together. But if we go back a bit to say 2011, and if you own Super Street Fighter 4 and your friend owned vanilla, then you can't play together online, and these are actually different games despite looking very similar on a surface level. This indicates a trend of title updates evolving into content updates, and it's sort of like how AAA games receive Game of the Year editions. These are the same game, it's just that this has much more content on the disc, and it also has a worse box art. And it makes sense that fighting games adopted this formula too, as to not alienate any future players. As we now live in a dystopian wasteland where I can't even buy a snack without sacrificing my firstborn instead of the zany utopia of the 90s, title updates that segregate a fighting game's player base have pretty much gone the way of the dodo, and it makes total sense as to why. With how expensive games are becoming to not only initially create, but also to market and maintain over an extended period, you'd want to get as many people as possible playing your game to maximize profits and player retention, and constant updates are the default way to achieve this. When a new season for a big fighting game comes out, everyone, regardless of how much time or money they can afford to spend on the game, is automatically welcomed into the new ecosystem, even if the game itself undergoes massive changes. It's not all perfect, however, as some argue that patch culture promotes a lack of adaptation to strong characters and techniques. Instead of a community sitting on a game for decades and making new discoveries over time about how to beat the godlike top tiers without the developers stepping in to make changes, these characters can now be made weaker in modern fighting games' future balance patches, and this phenomenon is representative of a wider shift in balance. Back in the arcade days, title updates were the balance patches, but now, any studio can and will release multiple patches over the span of several years for one game. For players who value consistency, this method is far from ideal, especially when a game that's laid dormant for years suddenly gets a new update that has major balance changes. But those who enjoy a more ever-changing meta will get the most out of consistent altercations to how their favorite fighting game functions. This also made me think about how modern fighting games would have been received had they launched back in the day if they never changed, and I think that something like, Tekken 8 Season 2 would have earned its place as one of the all-time greatest Kusege fighters had it released in 2005 on the PS2. For all the criticism that patch culture receives, I don't think anyone dislikes the monetary aspects of this trend. If you don't like constant bug fixes and balance changes, at least you don't have to pay for any of it, and this is surprisingly generous. Don't get me wrong, these games will try to nickel and dime you with avatar cosmetics, battle passes, and premium currencies, but I don't think there's a fighting game that forces you to buy any of these. When I was younger, I remember earning fight money in Street Fighter V by doing combo trials, and this is perhaps my favorite form of fighting game monetization. By completing tasks in the game, you use your points to buy new content, and it never requires you to spend any of your actual, real-world money. This was a nice little in-game economy, and before the game was released, Capcom went as far as to remove the premium currency they had planned to include at launch. I wish this system would make a comeback, but it seems that most companies would rather invest their resources into things like these instead. This growing pattern of in-game microtransactions has shifted the argument over time, as instead of people saying, "I'm tired of buying the same game over and over again," they now say, "I'm tired of being pressured into buying these microtransactions," and I feel that this is a very, very valid argument. Modern fighting games, for all their gameplay flaws, look amazing in terms of visuals and presentation. Seriously, these graphics are beautiful. So when you're being bombarded with microtransactions upon logging in, it can feel like their creators sometimes view their audience as sentient ATMs. It's really not that hard to find threads online where fighting game fans are voicing their displeasure about this monetization policy, and I'm sure we've all heard someone say, "Well, back in my day, we used to unlock characters through skill and not typing in our credit card details." This point is very sound, but it's mostly found within an older generation of fighting game fans who were there since the beginning, whereas younger players can sometimes think that a saying like this is corny because of how normalized current patches and microtransactions have become. Hell, I wasn't even alive when the PS2 came out, and even though I grew up with arcade fighters from the 90s and 2000s, exposure to DLC and microtransactions in more modern fighters has made me accept this policy as the norm, for better or for worse. It all sounds simple now that I've really thought about it, but I never realized before that the current status quo is essentially the replacement of old school title updates, and it begs the question, will patch culture and season passes stick around forever? It's easy to immediately say yes, but as technology progresses and fighting game fans have more avenues to easily make their voices heard, I wouldn't be surprised if a completely new form of game update arises in the next 10 to 20 years. Who knows, maybe the pendulum will swing back to box title updates for some reason, or maybe a fighting game will release that is fully complete from day one. Okay, I highly doubt that these will happen in reality. But questions like that acted as a thought experiment as I was preparing to make this video, and it made me critically think about how fighting game updates have evolved as life goes on, and how they will continue to evolve. Now that we've all graduated from the University of Fighting Game Monetization in really shitty video essays, I've come to one major conclusion. The death of traditional old-school title updates represent the ever-changing nature of the fighting game community's acceptance toward monetization policies, and I have no doubt that Capcom, Namco, SNK, etc. have all noticed this over the years. Being forced to spend money on updates that were pretty much new games is a trend that I'm glad has disappeared because of how it alienated those who couldn't get their hands on them for whatever reason, and I can personally attest to this. When I was a kid, I was crazy about Vanilla Street Fighter 4, man. It was like my favorite game ever. But I could never find a copy of Super when out and about, and as we didn't have internet at the time, I couldn't just buy the game online. And I also didn't have any friends as a kid who played fighting games, so I couldn't borrow a copy. When I finally laid eyes on it at a game store next to me earlier this year, I bought it right away to make younger Carnage happy, and it now sits nicely on my bed next to Lost Planet and Metal Gear Solid 4. If Super Street Fighter 4 had been an update in the vein of modern seasonal updates, I'm sure I could have just bought my Xbox 360 to a friend's house or something and just downloaded it there for free. But as this wasn't the case, I couldn't play the game for years! It goes without saying that many others would have experienced similar situations with their favorite games, especially if the game they wanted to play was never available digitally. But with how important the internet is to fighting games nowadays, I have no doubt that people missing out on these titles will start to become a thing of the past. In conclusion, I believe that patch culture will continue to act as a fun and interesting topic of conversation between the generations, but it also makes me think about how the genre's content will continue to evolve. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you very, very much for watching. I've never written anything like this before, and it was a great creative exercise, so I really appreciate your time and I hope you enjoyed watching. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.